Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the SSB's Soaring Society of Boulder's Glider Ground School. We're going to be finishing up our sessions on the glider flying from the topics from the Glider Flying Handbook. And of course, we don't really teach exactly the Glider Flying Handbook. We've got two CFI candidates, Jeff Clayton and Casey Meeks, who will be presenting this evening. I'll also be doing a concluding presentation on some of our local tasks that are set up, and you'll learn more about that during the presentations. Jeff and Casey are both CFIG candidates. Jeff's already a CFI in helicopter. Casey is not a CFI, but he's also a ground instructor. Does a lot of flying. Both Jeff and Casey are career aviators, career pilots. Jeff had a career in the Air Force flying the F-16. Casey flies all kinds of stuff. He owns 3 airplanes that I'm aware of, and now 2 gliders. He told me he just bought another glider. So he's an aviation, I don't want to use the term not, but aviation enthusiast, and does a lot of flying of all different sorts. So we've got some pilots here who really have a lot of experience in aviation and various types of aviation, and so they're going to present for you. And we're going to be getting into cross country tonight, which is sort of the capstone and the reason why we train in gliders, why we study gliders. It's really, a big kick to take off in a glider, get towed up, get off tow, be able to climb up to a reasonably high altitude, and then set a direction and go. And we'll talk tonight on part I'm going to talk about on tasks where you don't just get up and say, you know what, that direction over there looks pretty good. There's some clouds over there. Let's go over there and see that. We're going to explain what you do if you have certain points on the ground that you're going to overfly, turn points we call them, and also start points, which really adds a lot of difficulty. You have to be a lot better both at flying and at forecasting the weather to know that you're picking turn points that the lift will take you to. But anyway, enough of that. Let's let Jeff get started with his presentation. And Jeff, if you're ready, I'm going to give you the screen sharing here so you can share, and please go ahead. You're on mute.
Okay, am I off mute?
It sounds good.
Okay, let me just move things so I can actually present. All right, now you should see a slide. All right, well, anyone that was listening in or in the future listens in will know that we talked about thermaling, or I should say thermals, the kind of the science and theory behind thermal formation and the atmosphere and instability and such. And so what I'm going to focus on today, like Armin was saying, is how we actually use that. So kind of where the rubber meets the road, if you will. So first thing is, finding thermals that we would use for soaring in an obvious way is direct observation, which is seeing things that clearly inform us that there's a thermal. The big way there is cumulus clouds. Cumulus clouds mark the condensation of rising air. Other gliders, obviously, if somebody's circling, they're probably circling in lift, and that would be a thermal. Soaring birds are a great way because they do it for a living, if you will. So I always keep an eye out for birds, especially of the soaring variety. Dust, debris, and smoke rising up. An obvious example would be dust devils, but You can see leaves and dirt and even objects you wouldn't think would be floating up in the air, and they can also be marking thermals. And haze bubbles. So a haze bubble would be where thermal, if you're up high enough, you can see where the thermal is pushing up against an inversion layer, and that will mark, a bubble forming in that haze bubbles or haze domes, I've heard them called. So here's just a picture of some different cumulus clouds. And, not all cumulus clouds are created equally. There's a little more challenge to it than just flying to a cumulus cloud. The shape of the cloud, a moderate vertical development. We don't want, flat clouds such as maybe you'd see here is probably not going to be as ideally. There's not going to be an ideal thermal under that, nor do we want something that's, too huge where, it's going to be thunderstorm or rain coming out of it. Size, larger is generally better. You're going to mark that there could be a large thermal or more than one thermal. Texture, defined. So again, kind of have these wispy things here and this wispy one here, not necessarily meaning there's not a thermal there. They could be forming. But what we're really looking for is these defined edges like this on the upper right, or this one down below it, where we have better defined kind of cauliflower edges, they call it. And then the base of the cloud, flat and or concave, is even better and dark. So the undersurface of that has a nice defined surface, and if it has a concave, it's often because of the thermal. And this tendrils, experienced pilots will tell you that there's often like just wispy stuff coming out of the cloud that kind of indicates where that air is rapidly rising and condensing. The other way we can find thermals is what I call logical assessment. So, all right, where might we find a thermal? So maybe it's a day where there's no cumulus clouds, we don't see any birds, there's nobody else flying. Things we might look for are dark terrain. The sun absorbs, there's more energy absorbed from the sun, dark surfaces. Topography, orientation, and size. So the more perpendicular to the sun's rays the surface is, the more it's going to heat up. So, a good example here locally is the Flatirons, and they face east and they'll pick up that morning sun. And size, the larger the size of it, the more likely it's going to heat up a large area. Also looking for thermal triggers. So that's like, we call them discontinuities in the surface. So where it could be as simple as where there is that dark ground and then there's a tree line or a fence line even, or vehicles driving on the road. So things that are going to make those thermals that we talked about in the last presentation, it's going to make those thermals rise off the ground. It's going to kick that air into motion. Sudden changes in turbulence or wind. So if you're flying along and boom, 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 and now your right wing kicks up, there could be a thermal there, or even gusts. You might feel a sudden gust on the nose of the aircraft and just sense it pitching up. So it's kind of feeling the air, feeling the texture of the air, and really pre-flight planning. And we talked about that last time too. What local knowledge there is of where there's going to be thermals, and the weather, of course. Do we have an unstable atmosphere? There's going to be more likely to be thermals and more powerful thermals. So where, that's where to search, where not to search. Green areas, so large areas of trees, irrigated fields, lakes, rivers. So if it has lots of water, the water absorbs energy, a lot of energy before it releases it. So it's basically you're not getting the payback, if you will, from all that sun shining on it in the form of a thermal. Deep bowls, and what I mean by that is it's an area where that evening cool air is likely to just stay, or I think when I think of that, it's, on much more of a macro scale, but I think of like Estes Park. And when you fly in the mountains, you can see how Estes Park kind of sits in. It's bigger than that. There are thermals that get produced there, but that would be an example of a bowl shaped area. Shaded areas, if you're not getting sunlight, you're not going to produce thermals, or not as readily anyhow. Rain, which goes back to kind of where the water is sitting. So if a thunder shower just came through an area, it's probably not going to be producing thermals again, even for a while, even if there's a lot of sun shining on it again. Upwind to cumulonimbus. I guess what I'm getting at here is, large cloud formations, especially thunderheads, they kind of suck all the air in. So even if there's little clouds relatively nearby, I'm very suspect of trying to work clouds. Plus, you really don't want to be close to a thunderstorm, even upwind, too close. All right, next, we found a thermal. How do we want to enter it? I'll say the prime rule is clear your flight path. We don't want to be having mid-airs as we're all flying towards the thermal and not looking for each other. How do you know the thermal is a good one? So, maybe it's a thermal, but how do you know a good one? You're going to feel some sort of a surge. It could be a wingtip. It could be right on the nose if you're lucky. You want to time it. 5 seconds or more. It's kind of a general rule of thumb. Obviously, it depends on how fast you're flying. It depends on how strong the thermal is, how desperate you are, so forth and so on. So subject to skill, conditions, and situation. So feeling that surge for 5 seconds and/or hearing the vario. And yeah, you want to listen to your vario. You also want to listen to your senses, the seat of the pants, and what you're hearing with the wind, because that again will give you a good indication that there's a good thermal there. What do you do next? Slow down, which means pulling back on the stick generally to minimum sink or nearly. Right, so we know that the best performance of the glider as far as descending is minimum sink speed. Feel the air, decide to turn turn left or right. So generally, we're not going to fly straight into the middle of the thermal. Might push our left wing up or right wing up more. And if you can decide based on what you're feeling, that's you're ahead of the game. Second rule: if there are other gliders, turn in the same direction as the glider's already there. So we always want to thermal in the same direction. Much less likely to have a midair be able to keep track of each other if we're going in and turning in the same direction. And obviously, turn. Thermals are finite in size. We got to turn to stay in. And bank angle and speed depends upon the strength and size of the thermal. So how do you know, whether this is a good thermal on this day or not? Well, if you've already done some thermal, if you've started, flying different areas, you might say, hey, this thermal is a lot weaker than what I can expect today. And then again, how long and strong that surge is. You may choose to bypass that thermal, or you may take it. First turn is explorational. So if you're turning and you're in lift, I say 180 degrees, but it's for a considerable time, then you probably got the turn direction right. So if you chose to go right based on what you felt in lift, and you come around 180 degrees and you're still hearing that vario chirping, good. If not, you turn and 90 degrees later, you don't have lift anymore. We don't want to reverse the turn. We want to keep turning around to 270 degrees, roll out for a few seconds, and then continue that turn. And I'll have a graphic that kind of shows that here shortly. Will this thermal work? Again, going back to what are we expecting? What do we need? The size, strength, drift, behavior. By behavior, I mean, is it workable? You could have a really strong thermal, but it just is kicking you out every, few seconds. Don't forget, clear your turns. Even as you're in a thermal, someone else may join and not be. And, so you can't just assume that once you're in it, everything's going to be good. All right, so when we talk about staying in the thermal, we're talking about thermal centering. So if we center a thermal, that means we're doing the best we can as far as staying in the best part of lift. The best situation would be if we didn't have to bank at all. Keep that lift vector straight up. As you know, as you bank up more and more, you're losing a lot of that vertical lift, and your sink speed's going to increase correspondingly. So that's the ideal situation, but by definition, a thermal's not going to be that way. And they're going to be stronger closer to the core. So usually a 30 to 45 degree bank is the optimum trade-off sink rate and radius. and still remaining in the strongest part of the thermal. So it's a trade-off. It always is. Hey, I'd like to bank as little as possible, but if I do that, I'm going to fly out of the thermal, or I'm going to be on the outer edges of it and not going to be in the strongest part. And then another reality, through all the theory is thermals are complex. Often there's variable cross sections, so it might be kind of more thin or snaking in one area. The winds might push it in one way and then push it another way. There might be multiple cores, especially in a large thermal, and surges in certain areas and then in other areas of the thermal. So it's a very dynamic situation. So you use your senses, then that's something that builds over time. Because by senses, I don't just mean seat of the pants, but kind of knowing what's really going on and kind of keeping your situational awareness up. And the vario to gauge the thermal. So obviously the vario chirping higher in certain parts indicates that's the stronger part of the thermal. So seat of the pants feel of thermal surges is the quickest indicator. Nothing beats just that feeling of the thermal surging. Wind gusts and lulls will also give you an indication of whether you're hitting the outside, especially of very strong thermals that have a very strong core. The gusts and lulls will be very apparent. Like I said, the vario chirping away, soaring birds and debris, always keep an eye out for them. I've been in thermals where I thought I was doing great, and I was. There's a bird that's centered a little bit different. I followed that bird, that hawk or eagle, and lo and behold, it's a little bit better where they are. And I talked about spatial orientation as part of your senses. And I always, from time to time, at least, even if I'm down low, is looking up to see if I can see where a cloud is either forming or has already been there that I might be thermaling up towards, and try to draw a relation from where I've been to getting to that cloud, so that I can get a better idea of where I am in space. So all centering methods make some kind of shift in the circle position. That's really what it means. Is I'm third circling, and now I need to move this circle over to be more in the center of thermal, in the core of the thermal. It implies that, if we want to talk theory of centering, a consistent thermal shape and texture. So in other words, it's very consistent. Consistent bank angle and speed between corrections. And this is, I think, a very big thing, especially starting out thermaling. And it's a big reason that we talk about having a really good control of your turns, your steep turns, be at the right bank angle, right speed, and being able to roll out on a consistent heading. Is because if you're not doing that, then you don't know whether you're not in the core of the thermal because you flew 10 knots faster for a while, or you let off on your bank angle, or whether because you just really weren't in the core. So if we're not able to be consistent in our turning, then we're really going to have a hard time doing corrections. And it's complicated because the air is trying to push you around, and you are constantly having to maneuver to keep that bank angle and keep that pitch attitude. So you're either adjusting towards the strongest lift or away from the sink/weak lift. And it's a mechanic. You can think of it mechanically, like this is what I do, and this is how much I turn, and this is how long I wait, versus a perceptive application. Again, the more experience you get, the more you're going to use perceptions versus just a mechanical application of that. And it's also going to vary depending on what kind of geography, time of day, different days. I mean, thermals have different personalities in different places, especially if you're going long distance, and different times of the day. Late thermals often are very mellow. So there's a lot of difference in how you're going to do that centering, and how much you have to center based on those different conditions. So here's some diagrams, and what this is basically showing is if you came in and maybe your left wing went up, and now, and you decided to turn right for whatever reason, and now you're in sync. The idea is to keep that turn going for 270 degrees, roll out for 8 or 2, and then continue your turn. There are problems with any centering method, especially if you're doing it very mechanically off a vario. How long was the vario? If you felt this surge here, but you actually heard it here, and we're acting on that, and your 270-degree turn may have you go out this way. So it's always important to realize that the vario is not a perfect indication instantaneously of your lift, and to use your senses to help you out on that. Another method that's touted is bank angle change method. Again, like if you look at this person thermal in here, the idea is when they feel the lowest vario indication, then they're going to so in open and tighter and lift, open and sink. So they feel like they're in a little bit of sink here. They open up their turn for a little bit, and then they tighten it up when they feel that lift again. They'd go here. And if you open it up too much, yeah, you might be too wide and fly right out of that thermal. And then there's another variation of that, open and lift and tighten and sink. If you're in the core, and I would say more like that you're very close to the core. So the idea there being that when you feel that lift, again, straighten out, get to min sync, feel that surge, and then it's a timing thing. When do I get back in and tighten that turn back up again? There's this guy, Eric Cardin, that I've seen. I don't know how big he is in soaring circles, but he has a fair amount of videos, and he has this 1, 2, 3 method, which is really just a variation on that, but maybe with that nomenclature, it's easier to learn. It's basically fly a consistent speed and bank. So again, consistency for one circle when you hit the lift. It doesn't matter. You basically are just saying, I'm going to fly the circle. I'm going to pay attention to where the lift is and where it isn't. Check 2 times around. So if you do a correction after that, then he says fly 2 more times around that circle. So don't even correct for 2 complete 360s. Decide where in the circle the lift is the best, and then fly 3/4. So that's the 3/4 of a circle from the best lift and roll out. So it sounds a lot like the 90 270 method, and resume circling and repeat. But I do like the way he explains things, so I put a link on there for him. He's very good at describing thermal and centering. Collision avoidance, talked a little bit about clearing your turns and turning the same direction. We always want to enter a thermal from the outside. So if you see this little diagram here, we don't want to be coming in the way B is showing here, or C. At the very least, we want to be, and we don't want to be A, because it would be going opposite the directions of everyone else. So D at the very least, and E coming in from literally outside of where the other persons, if you imagine where their circle is, it makes it easier to just then bank into and join that thermal in the same circling area. You want to try to predict that entry, and there's a lot of technique. I have an advantage of having been an Air Force pilot. We did a lot of what we call rejoins on other aircraft for formation, and it is very similar to joining a thermal, except for we are trying to join to the aircraft. So all I have to do is we'll just do the exact opposite of trying to join to the airplane. But getting into that circular area is a very predictive type of thing. You don't want to fly directly over or under gliders. Obviously, if you're directly over someone, you don't know if they're pulling up, and if you're directly under them, they're going to be nervous about you pulling up into them. Use the radio, especially if there's a lot of aircraft and it's getting complicated. And I try to always say when I'm joining a thermal that someone's in, if I'm going to be anywhere near them, if I'm not way below or way above them. Be predictable. So don't be radically changing your course. It makes it a lot harder to thermal the way you want when you're with other gliders, other pilots. But you just always need to try to be as predictable as possible. So, obviously not rolling the opposite direction, not pulling up excessively. And exiting thermal, again, normally when we exit thermal, we put our speed up. Well, you want to delay a little bit before pushing the nose way over, because as you do that, you're descending, and maybe you descend right into somebody that you didn't see. And that must be the end of my presentation.
Casey, you want to roll into yours?
Bet. Thanks, Jeff. That was excellent. Let's see. All right. Can you see that chapter 10, Armand?
Yes, sir.
All right. Great. I'll pick up where Jeff left off. So in chapter 10, we talk about soaring techniques, and on 10:10, it starts to talk about different types of soaring. So I'd like to talk a little bit about ridge and or slope soaring. So we talked about ridge soaring a little bit when we talked about weather and mechanisms for lift. But keep in mind that, we do need surface wind. Ideally, for a sailplane, probably 15 to 20 knots will give us reliable ridge or slope soaring lift. And the wind needs to be perpendicular to the ridge and not more than 45 degrees cross. And that makes a huge difference, not only in the quality of the lift and the height of the lift band, but it also makes a big difference in the dangers that you might find with obstacles or variances in the ridge, because ridges with irregular profiles can create a lot of hazards. This picture that we have here is actually just probably the most idealized ridge here in the continental US. And this is called Point of the Mountain in Utah. Sits between Provo and Salt Lake City. And it's a really unique place because it's just the perfect angle for a ridge. Remember that the ideal ridge slope is not vertical, and it's not just a small lumpy hill. It's something that's about a 4-to-1 ratio between the angles there. This is the north side of the ridge, and this is a really interesting place because there's a big lake down here in Provo, and there's obviously the big lake up to the north in Salt Lake City, and those actually create really consistent winds, diurnal winds that blow from the south during the morning, and it blows very consistently from the north in the afternoon. And this ridge is probably just about the most perfect ridge lift that we have in the continent here. This is an interesting one, though. If we look at this profile here, it's actually got a bench in it. This is a pretty big bench. There's actually homes down here on this bench. But this lower bench is regularly flyable. This is a very, very popular hang gliding and paragliding spot. I'm sure the sailplanes hit it on their way transitioning through the valley as well. But very consistent lift down here. And then pilots will typically bench up here to the second bench and just get thousands of feet high and connect into the mountains for thermal flying. Looking at this topography, we can see, though, that there is actually a pretty big hazard here, and this big step can create a potential for a big rotor. So if you were flying in this area, you'd want to be on any scale, you'd want to be suspect of something that had a big break in here that could create some sort of a rotor. Keep in mind, too, that our lift zone actually tilts forward with increasing height. And so the best lift will typically be found on the face of the ridge until nearing the height, and then it will actually start to tilt forward, as seen in this diagram. Remember, it's more or less tangential to the ridge as we get higher. That's really important because the temptation might be to just hug on this ridge and just keep going back over the top. But remember that the lift is not very good back here. We can actually enter the sink zone back here. It can make it very hard to penetrate back out. And of course, that's where most of the obstacles are going to be too. So be very, very careful when flying close to a ridge to look for power lines, high power lines, and towers as well. So that can really cause a lot of trouble for you if you have to swerve suddenly to miss an obstacle. When ridge soaring too, we typically never have an idealized ridge like we saw there in Salt Lake City. A lot of times we might have a ridge with a lot of gullies in it and maybe a lot of spurs. Spurs can create a lot of issues for us, especially if the wind is cross, as it is in this example. So the wind will typically hit this spur and can rotor across the backside and create significant lift. So if you were flying this ridge and you were in lift here, but you saw that a spur was coming up, you'd probably want to move your way out in front of the ridge so that you could avoid that big sinky area that could cause a lot of surprise. Also too, bowls will collect a lot of wind, really just like blowing into a cup or something, and it's going to create localized, very strong lift wherever that wind collects. So you can expect to see that. The speed to fly when ridge soaring theoretically would be min sync. That obviously is going to be the most efficient. However, it's really recommended to fly faster than min sync because of several factors. Keep in mind that min sync is very close to stall speed, so we don't have a lot of margin there. We're flying very, very close to the hill. Maneuverability may be very poor near min sync. Most gliders fly okay there, but they certainly have better controllability at higher air speeds. And then, of course, all these irregular profiles can create complex turbulence. In this case, wind flowing over the top here will act just like water in a river as it flows over eddies and things like that. So we want to make sure that we're always cognizant of which direction the wind is blowing and the mechanical turbulence that we might find around that ridge. So remember always to fly faster than min sync when near that ridge for better controllability. Also, approaching a ridge can be really tricky. If we look at our normal turn radius, we understand that in a no wind, we would have the same expected turn radius that we always have. But flying directly downwind into a ridge with that same turn radius with a 15-knot wind in this case could cause us to impact the ridge there. So you can find yourself very, very, very surprised that we're not there. Of course, you would probably see that coming, but that you might be much too close to recover from it. The temptation might be to turn harder and or pull, and we could stall and or spin into the face. And when you look at especially a lot of the competition pilots that have accidents, it's being very aggressive on a ridge here and just pushing it too far. So be very, very careful there. Approaching a ridge, it's very important that we approach the ridge at an angle. So we wouldn't want to approach from a downwind side. If the wind was perpendicular to the ridge, in this case, you'd want to approach at least with a 45-degree angle and just kind of slide into that ridge. And then, of course, when we're in that ridge and we have a crosswind in that case, you're going to find that you're flying in a crab position. So very important to point the nose of the glider out into the valley, and you'll find that you'll fly a parallel line to that ridge. And then you can start to work your way in and out of that lift band in order to find the optimum lift. So again, don't approach directly from an upwind position and perpendicular to the ridge. We want 45 degrees and then establish a crab. And then another very important factor is you always want to make all turns away from the ridge. So every single turn we do should not be back into the ridge. Even if we think we've got the clearance, that can be very surprising. We always want to make that turn away from the ridge and then turn back into the ridge in order to reestablish the lift. There's several really important rules to follow when we're ridge soaring, and it's very important that all soaring pilots understand this completely because there's no time to second guess this. As Jeff said in his previous presentation, we don't want to fly directly over or under another glider because it can be almost impossible to see a glider below us, and there may be something unexpected that we can't maintain the separation that we need. Also, when you're overtaking another glider, it's very important that you pass them close to the ridge, not on the outside. Keep in mind that the glider in the lead in this case has the right of way, and they always should have the option, if they find sink, to be able to turn out into the valley. So if it's important enough for you to pass this glider, then you need to make sure there's room to pass on the inside to allow the slower glider to turn away from the mountain if they need to sink. Sometimes this just doesn't work. Sometimes there's just not enough room to pass on the inside. And in that case, if you're overtaking a glider, you may just have to take a turn, fly back down the ridge, create more space, and then synchronize in a better way with the other glider. Also, approaching head on, it's important to remember the orientation here. It's the glider with the ridge to their right always has the right of way. So in this case, this top glider, the ridge is to their right, it's off their right wing, so they can maintain whatever line they choose, and the other glider should alter their path away so that they don't pinch them. Keep in mind too that it is your responsibility to provide enough room for this glider to turn away from the mountain if they needed to. If they encountered sink, they might be expected to turn into the valley. So those rules are very, very, very important. I always like to throw a little bit of video in the presentations, and I wanted to throw this in. This is advanced ridge soaring, so don't expect this is what it's going to be like on day one over the flat irons. But there's a couple things I'd like to show you in this video by Stefan And this shows him flying in New Zealand. And I'll pause it just a couple times to demonstrate some of the techniques that we've already seen. One of the first things we see in this video is what we would consider an irregularity. This is a large gully associated with this. Obviously, this is on an ocean with a sea breeze flowing onto this ridge. One thing I'd like to point out is his position in the lift band. We see that he's not directly over the lip of the ridge where you might expect the best lift to be. He's actually positioned himself out in front a little bit, and obviously maintaining quite a bit of lift and converting that into an airspeed. But approaching a gully like this, it's really important to understand that the wind is going to act like a venturi through there. There's going to be no lift, and there's going to be significant acceleration through this gully and up here. So you would expect not to have any lift here. Now, he's obviously going fast enough. He's going to skip over this in a heartbeat. But if you had to cross through a large gap in the mountains or a large gully, you would probably have to move out a bit to avoid the most sink and the most venturi in here so that you don't get trapped, and then reestablish the lift on the other side. And a great turn away from the terrain there. So pretty inspiring and pretty incredible. And I think it's great to remember why we get into this and what it can be for us. I wouldn't have the selfie stick hanging out the window your first day there, but it is really cool and a really powerful experience. When we think about ridge soaring seems kind of boring in concept, right? We talk about thermal flying and wave flying, but it's actually an incredible mechanism, and there's lots of places in the world where that's very viable. Here in Colorado, it's a little bit trickier to find ridge lift that's predictable and usable in all times. But again, like we said last week, the Boulder Flatirons are actually a really fantastic spot that's close by. You can practice some of those techniques too. So really amazing. One of the things I wanted to kind of throw in there, and Jeff talked about this too, but understand that we never really live in a vacuum of a single type of lift. We never fully, especially here in Colorado, operate solely in thermals or solely in ridge lift or wave or convergence. And that's just really because of the nature of the air. One of the things I learned early on as a soaring pilot was to kind of visualize and understand that we are flying in a fluid, and air has viscosity or a stickiness to it. We don't feel that normally. We don't think that it's sticky in that case, but it really is. And so a good visual is to take the profile of a mountain and just flip it upside down, and then imagine you stuck it in honey, and then you very slowly pulled it out. And where the honey drips off the ridges and the points and all those convergence points, those are the most likely thermal triggers. And Jeff talked a little bit about thermal triggers, but thermals a lot of times need some motivation to depart the terrain. They'll actually stick to the terrain. They'll stick in these bowls and they'll stick on the faces. So you could find yourself ridge soaring up to the top, and then you might find yourself thermaling from that point on. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But very important, if you are ridge soaring into thermals, that you want to safely fly the ridge lift until you've fully connected with that thermal. It's also very important when flying ridge lift to be careful about drifting over the back. A lot of times you'll be in mixed lift like this. You'll be in a thermal that blows over the back. And a lot of times, because of the shape of the mountain, the air can really accelerate very quickly, and you can find yourself very, very quickly behind the mountain. And if you lose contact with that thermal climbing out, you can find yourself in pretty serious sink on the backside of the mountain. So very important to really commit to that thermal as you connect over the top, and thermal like your life depends on it, because in some cases, if you find yourself in sync on the backside, that can get really scary. So definitely watch that rate. A lot of times a thermal will accelerate over the back pretty rapidly, and then as it builds, it will go more vertical too. So you can really understand that you've established with a thermal at that point when it stops blowing over the mountain as much and starts climbing as much. And keep in mind too that there really are 4 types of lift. We've got thermal lift, slope lift, wave lift, and convergence lift. And we're really flying in a combination of all of those anytime we go fly, especially here in Colorado. Real quick story that I'll relate to talk about the stickiness of a thermal. I was flying a task in a contest in a paraglider years ago out in Eastern Washington. And I was at about 500 feet AGL, and I was in a thermal bubble that was simply moving down downwind, and it was paralleling a road. And I was really low, only about 500 feet. And this thermal absolutely would not lift off. It just was stuck to the ground, and I was able to maintain more or less zero sync. But for miles and miles and miles, this thermal wouldn't lift. And to complicate the fact, I was being hunted down by a falcon that I'd flown over their nest, and it was absolutely just pissed at me and attacking me at every opportunity. So I dealt with this falcon for a while, and then this thermal drifted down a road, and the road made a 90-degree turn. And that 90-degree turn was enough of a trigger for this to trigger and to climb, and was able to take that thermal all the way back up to cloud base. But for me, it was one of the most powerful examples of how the air is sticky and can really stick to the ground. And boy, let me tell you, I was sure glad to get away from that falcon after so many miles of drifting with her past that nest. The other type of soaring I'd really like to talk about is wave soaring. And wave soaring is a just incredible aspect of our sport. If we think about this sport, it can be everything from ridge soaring on a beach all the way up to wave soaring up into the upper atmosphere. It's really probably the most dynamic and incredible type of aviation that we can ever experience. If you haven't already, please check out the Perlin project. The Perlin project was born from the idea of Steve Fawcett and some of his partners, and continues today. They had a little bit of a slowdown in COVID, but they had flights up over 70,000 feet this last year, and are sponsored now by Airbus with a goal of transonic flights of up to altitudes of 100,000 feet. So actually a very modest design, but they're flying typically down in South America. They do fly out of Minden as well, connecting with high altitude wave. So Armand described that, the mechanics behind wave soaring and how a wave sets up. But we'll take a little look at some of the other concepts about connecting to the wave. So wave flight really starts with preparation. So this was an interesting look today at the wave conditions, and predicted in SkySight to have some wave. This is a 3D wave product that they produce, and showed some wave, but it looked like it was put pretty far back. And then of course we have kind of the 2D model as well that shows that there was predicted to be light wave today. Jeff, you actually got to fly today. Can you relate your experience trying to connect to the wave today?
Yeah, I didn't do a great job. I connected with Rotor, so
Yeah.
that's part of the, but as you said, I think it was a little bit back, and it was a little lower than I was comfortable going that far back. So yeah. I popped off the toe probably a little prematurely, and probably didn't work what I had high enough before I tried to push back, and spent a lot of the day just little chunky bits of rotor. It was exciting. It was very different, as you said.
How far back did you tow today?
I towed to maybe about 2 miles east of Gold Lake.
Mhm.
And my big pushback got me about to Gold Lake. I mean, when you're going into 40, 50, 60 knots, and maybe you'll talk about this, you don't make a lot of headway, but you can go down really quick. So it's so far for me, it's always been exciting and not always in the right way. But
Absolutely. That's cool. So yeah, Jeff, looks like you were kind of in this area. And yeah, I mean, who knows? I don't know if anyone else flew the wave today, but luckily it was relatively weak today and set up. But and we didn't really get a classic wave indications that we do sometimes. Didn't see a lot of the big standing lenticulars. I saw a few pop up way up north tonight. But you know, hopefully more big wave days coming. I know we're both looking forward to that. So that's cool. So a lot of wave flights really requires a different level of preparation than just going out and doing a local flight or a thermaling flight. And as Jeff said, it's always important to be, you know, have something in mind that we're going to fly. But if we're going to do a wave flight here at a Boulder, and Boulder is just one of the leading places in the world for wave conditions. And we definitely have that a lot, especially in the winter time. But keep in mind too, we do have FARs for oxygen. We're obviously starting off high anyway, but FAR 91 to 11, that's a great one to be able to commit to memory. Really impresses the examiner when you can throw those numbers out there. But remember that anytime we're above 12.5 for more than 30 minutes, up to and including 14, we need oxygen. Any time above 14, we need to have supplemental oxygen. We can expect in the wave for it to be very, very cold too. We talked about lapse rates last week, and those lapse rates in the atmosphere are going to continue, and we may get very, very high. So it's going to be very cold and low sun angle too. We probably aren't getting a lot of canopy heating in the wintertime. So be prepared for the cold and be prepared to get out of the wave if you're getting too cold. Keep in mind also true airspeed considerations. We talked about flutter a few lessons back and how important it is to keep that in mind. But you may have a limit of 100 knots or less indicated when you get high in a wave. Also make sure that the aircraft is pre-flighted correctly and that you have a lubricant on your flight controls that's cold tolerant. Probably wouldn't want to have a lot of grease or anything on there, something that might freeze or trap a lot of liquids. And we need to be cautious about carrying water, or if you have to carry water, I know a lot of pilots use an antifreeze like glycol or something in the water if they absolutely have to, but you could expect that water to freeze. That could cause damage on structural surfaces if you're carrying ballast or if you had tail ballast. In that case, we want to be very, very careful with that because that water, when it does freeze, is going to expand. Also, battery considerations. I'm sure you've all had a battery that's gotten cold and understand that our amperage output isn't as high when that battery gets cold. So something that might work great in the summertime, we might find that we just don't have enough battery to support radios and other systems on the aircraft quite as long as we have. And then of course, imagine bailing out, here with a parachute, maybe at 18,000 feet or even higher. And Armand, I don't know if you could maybe say a word about the wave window here. And I know we have a push to get the wave window turned on again this year, but how high could we expect to get if we got the wave window activated this year?
Yeah, I don't know what the height is that they're working on for the wave window. There's been something of a reshaping of the wave window. The older one went pretty far west, well west of the Continental Divide. And the FAA wanted to get rid of that part, which of course we're fine with because there's no wave on the west side. So like that was an easy, okay, we'll give you that one. Yeah, I don't know. It's being worked on. It sounds very bureaucratic. And I don't know if they'll get there in time for this wave season or not. Of course, you can still fly wave below 18,000 feet. And Casey, if I may, I would like to add something on your FAR 91 to 11 oxygen requirement. Yeah. And that is correct. That is the FAA requirement, but 10,000 feet is recommended, especially for glider, where you're constantly making decisions. So have your oxygen, if you're flying a glider, have your oxygen on at 10,000 feet, even though the rule is 12.5.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Armand. That's a great considerations. Also keep in mind too that there's a great chart that's called time of useful consciousness. And I always found this one interesting. And Jeff is going to get into the physiological aspects too, but it really is interesting to see that, if we get to 18,000 feet, and we're in good shape, we might be conscious for 20 to 30 minutes. Keep in mind too that our ascension rate is really fast a lot of times. So it's a little different. You might be like us, you go out and climb 14ers, but it takes hours to climb a 14er, and you actually have a little more acclimation, where in a glider, you might get to 14,000 feet in just a matter of minutes if you've got a good thermal or in wave. So much harder for the body to acclimate when you're rising that rapidly. So at 18,000 feet, 20, 30 minutes, if we got up, I think the wave window typically is probably up to 24, 25,000 feet if we can get it open. If you have an oxygen system failure up there, 3 to 5 minutes is about all you've got. So there have been a lot of accidents in the past that were related to oxygen failures. So having another oxygen source is an important consideration here. And if you did have to bail out, maybe even having a bailout bottle would make sense in that case, but it becomes a lot of gear. So let's talk about contacting the wave. There's really two ways to get into the wave. You can tow into the wave, or you could soar into the wave. And when we soar into the wave, there's multiple ways we could do that. We could thermal into the wave, we could climb the rotor, or transition from slope soaring. So this first one that we're going to look at here is just thermaling into the wave. This is interesting because if you imagine where Boulder would sit, we've got the big mountains here and then other mountains, and we're probably towing more or less into the primary wave. We could see that that primary wave here. So you might have the opportunity, if you went a little bit further east here in Boulder, to actually thermal into the wave. If we can find a thermal that is timed exactly right, that's going to take us through and connect with the upcycle here on the wave. So that's going to be lift here. And we're also going to be connecting with the upside of the rotor in this case. So that really great lift, that thermal is going to turn into wave lift, and we could connect into the wave that way. The other way we can do that is to climb into the rotor. So keep in mind, and Jeff, I think that's probably was your plan today, was to tow in there and climb into the primary rotor. Keep in mind that roll cloud or that rotor is going to be cycling more or less in a clockwise fashion. So for us in Boulder, we're going to have to penetrate through the sink, which is pretty horrendous sometimes. And then connect into that wave. And if we can connect with that rotor, we might be able to climb kind of in that same way into the wave, but that can be really, really tough. Keep in mind too that the rotor is typically stationary over the ground. It might be relatively small. So we want to perform just small circle eights with occasional straight legs in the front of that rotor and able to not fly into the back of it. It's a really rapid transition from flying in the rotor to flying in the wave. So this can be extremely rough flying through that rotor, especially in the up part too. It can be relatively violent, and you'll know you've connected with the wave when it becomes instantly smooth. So really rapid transition when transitioning into the wave there. There we go. And then transition from slope soaring. So we talked about this a little bit last week, but there is a possibility that you could be slope soaring somewhere. We could have a west wind in this case, and we could be ridge soaring, and we could actually find ourselves connecting with a wave in that case. That's probably only going to happen if we've got the proper wavelength. And remember, that's called constructive interference, right? So it is interfering, but it's constructive interference, and it's enhancing this wave sign and creating a greater wave back behind it. So you could actually find yourself there. Back when I was flying hang gliders a lot, there was a great story that there was a constructive interference wave that would set up in Fairplay over a small, tiny ridge called Chicken Ridge. But a lot of the old timers would regularly go out there. They'd foot launch off a small hill and be in smooth ridge lift, and then find themselves well over, up to 18,000 feet in a hang glider. Just absolutely mystified by how they got there. And they figured out under the right conditions, they were actually just getting into wave through constructive interference, and it was smooth the entire time. So that would be great if we could do that here in Boulder, but doesn't really support what we have here. So the other way to get into wave is simply to tow into the wave. This can be really tough. Obviously, we want to tow around the rotor if possible. That might happen maybe further up north where the mountain range ends or has a relief. You might actually be able to tow around the side into the wave lift, which would be really nice. Unfortunately, here we have a pretty consistent mountain range to our west called the Continental Divide, so we don't have a lot of breaks there. So probably just have to tow through it. So through that rotor, you might expect a tow path like this through that rotor. So a little bit of climb here, and then lots of sink here, more of a climb, and then hopefully we can tow into that smooth wave portion if we can make it through the rotor there. However, we want to expect moderate to severe turbulence in that rotor, and it's very, very normal to be out of position on one of those tows. That's a good reason for us to practice boxing the wake, like we talked about a few weeks ago, because you're going to find yourself pretty much boxing the wake at times as well. Also, lots of slack line as you get rapid decelerations of the tow plane. You may find that you've got lots of slack line. It's better for us to tow in a normal high position, because understanding that we're going to potentially be in a slack line position, we don't want to have any interference possibilities with that rope. So we want to try to maintain just the normal high tow position. Again, keeping in mind that if we had something that was so violent that we could no longer see the tow plane, we want to release immediately and then get ourselves into a safe position after that. Again, that transition is going to be mostly downtrends replaced by uptrends with increasing turbulence as we go through this rotor, and then a very smooth transition to wave can be very, very quick. It is important, though, that as soon as we do connect with that wave, we don't want to drift downwind and lose the wave immediately. That could be very bad. Let me show you this other quick video here, just a couple of snippets here. This is tow through a rotor. Yep.
There's a button. If you check on the share screen, there's a button that you optimize the video.
On the share screen.
Yeah, go to the green share screen, and then on the lower part, on the very lower part, next to where it says share sound, it'll say optimize for video clip. Are you seeing that?
I don't see that. Can you not see that video?
Yeah, go ahead and do the video. It's just that button helps.
Okay, cool. So this is a tow through a rotor. We'll just watch a few seconds of this, but what I'd like you to notice is the release handles and the rudder position handles just going absolutely negative at times. So you can really see he does a great job of following the tow plane in this case, but very, very turbulent. We can see here, obviously, big control movements necessary to stay in that position. And I like that this pilot regularly reaches up to the release handle too, ready to release in case out of position. And then the next segment here, I'll show you the connection to the wave. So you can really see the difference here in the tow through the rotor and then the connection with the wave. And you can hear the sound of that screaming vario. He's climbing nicely now and almost just perfectly smooth climbing in the wave. Cool. So other things that we want to keep in mind flying in the wave, we want to understand that initially that lift may be weak. And if we look at the vertical profiles, a lot of times the wave really won't set up very well at the lower altitudes. And if we look at SkySight, we can actually see different vertical velocities at different profiles here too. So very important to understand that if you do connect with the wave initially, let's say it happens down at 10 or 12,000 feet, which is probably as high as the tow plane will ever be able to take us, that initial lift may be weak, but we want to stay with the climb, and typically that will improve. Also, if the wind is really strong, 40 knots or more, something near min sync, we just want to point into the wind. In the best case, we would maintain min sync, so we're efficient. But it's very, very important in this case to watch the ground speed and make sure it's not negative by watching our ground track. So GPS speed can be very important. I've been caught surprised before on a paraglider, flying down in the San Luis Valley, where I thought I had penetration and I had 2 or 3 knots of ground speed, only to realize that it was 2 or 3 knots of ground speed backwards. So, you know, you don't want to find yourself in that position. If we fly at a speed that's less than the wind, we'll slowly start drifting back and we'll end up in the wave sink, basically get pushed way out the back. Ideally, we would fly exactly into the wind, and you could almost just perch there, going straight up in the lift. Sometimes we may want to transition. We might be flying cross country somewhere, so we might actually want to go somewhere. Or we may find that we're flying too fast. And if that happens, you'll find yourself flying out the front and the lift gradually decreasing as we move out of the wave lift. In that case, it's very important not to turn around. We don't want to ever do a 180-degree turn in the wave if we're trying to stay in the wave. In this case, we just want to start crabbing. That's going to create a ground speed that's less than the wind speed, and that will just let us very slowly push back into that optimum wave position. So very important to not just turn and run, because you'll quickly find yourself in the sink side. The best lift is found on the upwind side of the rotor cloud or up in the lenticulars. And again, if too far forward, we want to just start working our way very slowly to the back. If we do lose the wave, and this may happen for lots of reasons, we might be nearing the top of the wave. You might have simply moved out of the best lift band, or it's possible that as the wind speed changes, that the wavelength of the lee wave has also changed. Remember, it more or less stays in a steady position as long as all the environmental factors are the same. But if the wind speed or direction changes, that's going to change the characteristics of the wave as well. So very important, if we do lose the wave, to search upwind first, because we can always quickly drift back towards that lee. Again, we don't want to try downwind first because you're probably going to blow right out the back of it. And always be prepared that even though you're in smooth wave lift, and especially if you've lost contact with it, you may end up flying downwind back into the rotor, and that rotor obviously is going to be very turbulent again. So we want to be very mindful of our maneuvering speed in that case, as well as our max true air speed. So 2 very important speeds to keep in mind too. And then also keep in mind that we might connect with the wave and want to actually move upwind. This is a great example of a primary wave like we might find here, a secondary wave, and a tertiary wave. In this example, the pilot is thermaled up in a tertiary wave in that optimum position, able to connect to the wave, able to push forward enough to get into a secondary wave, get high there. And then pushing into the primary, as Jeff said, you know, once you're facing that 50 or 60 or 70 knot headwind, you might find that your penetration just isn't what it could be. So you may find that you're penetrating back in through the sink and through the rotor. In that case, your only option is to continue to push upwind until we connect with the upside of the rotor and reestablish that wave position. Great. Next section is for human factors, so I'll step back into that, but I'll let Jeff take back over and continue talking about cross country.
All right, thanks, Casey. Okay, what I'm going to focus on is just on the planning portion. So what you need to think about as you're getting into cross-country soaring, but also some of what you think about at any given flight. We might call typically, if we know kind of what we want to do, whether it's defined points or even if we just say, hey, I want to fly north to the Laramie Valley and back, or up to the Wyoming border, we'll call that a task. So when you hear me refer to a task, that's what I'm talking about. Starting out, you know, always have a number 1 rule, right? Or first rule, cross-country soaring is always to stay within glide range of a suitable landing area. So, you know, lo and behold, the person that just gets so confident that they fly over terrain that there's no way that they can glide out of there, and you know, don't find lift where they were hoping to find it. So always make sure that you have a place where you can land. It doesn't have to be an airport or a runway. but it does need to be someplace that you are going to be able to land the aircraft safely. So when we're thinking about planning a task, we want to think about our experience. You know, and when I talk about experience there, I'm talking about with cross-country soaring. You know, obviously, the more skilled we get, the more distance and the more you know, difficult type of task we might take on. When it comes to skill, we're talking about, you know, if we don't have a good ability to thermal consistently and you know, move from thermal to thermal, we really don't want to even be going into cross-country soaring. And knowledge is, you know, specifically about your aircraft and about what you're seeing with the weather and so forth, but also you know, what the terrain that you're going to be flying over and so forth. Equipment, knowing your glider, knowing what its capabilities are. You know, as you push the nose over, how far is it? How good of a glide is it going to get? So knowing that, and also knowing your computer, if you have one on board, whatever you're using for navigation, really knowing how to use that well, because you don't want to be fumbling around with that, and when you're over unfamiliar terrain. And by gear, you know, we talked about this in another school lesson. You know, making sure that you're prepared for if you do have to land out or, heaven forbid, bail out of the aircraft. Knowing what weather's going to support the type of task, obviously that has a huge effect on what kind of task you're going to be able to fly, is where the weather is conducive to soaring, and so forth. The terrain that you fly over, of course, you know, knowing where you're going to likely encounter a ridge or thermal lift or convergence and so forth, and deciding what type of a route you want to fly. You know, triangle routes are a challenging thing to do in gliding, but often we just do an out and back or straight line type of a route. So things you want to do if you're especially new to soaring and new to an area is mapping out a route. And I'm not going to go through all the details on this, but you should be familiar with how to use a plotter and some sort of a calculator or flight computer. And then we'll talk about glide rings a little bit too. So, you know, you're thinking about when you're mapping out a route, potential task, you know, what kind of distances you want to have. This one here is showing a triangular route, you know, how much between each legs, and so forth. You know, the shape of that, again, whether you're going to do a triangular route and maybe how acute of an angles on those triangles, so forth. Airspace is a very important thing to take into consideration. So understanding how that's depicted on a sectional chart, you know, your Class B, C, and D airspace, your restricted airspaces, your MOAs, military training routes, temporary flight restrictions. So understanding all of those features and knowing how to navigate around them or what you're going to do in regards to them. Landmarks, you know, it helps to what to expect to see along your route, whether it's a city or major roads, power lines, towers, other terrain features. And I would say probably major reason for mapping out a route is just knowing your potential land out locations. On a sectional chart, obviously you're not going to see the micro terrain, but certainly you can see airports and study up on which airports might be conducive if you needed to land out. So there's two ways of navigating, at least unless you're an instrument pilot. Pilotage, which is comparing what you see outside the cockpit, outside the canopy, with charted landmarks. So keeping up with where you are using that method, or dead reckoning, which is computing a course and location using winds and true airspeed. So basically figuring out in advance. Well, as a glider pilot, obviously we don't control or track along the ground with that kind of accuracy. So we use pilotage. But it's still important to be familiar with the concepts of dead reckoning. So as you're planning out your route, if you have a strong wind, knowing on each of those legs, how that's going to impact you, and understanding the concepts of dead reckoning will help you with that. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but this is the basis behind dead reckoning, is the so-called wind triangle. So you basically are using geometry, using that wind, what your heading and airspeed are, and that's going to compute out what your actually course across the ground and your ground speed are. Pilotage, this, just I put this up here so you can see, all this symbology that you need to be familiar with. Temporary flight restrictions, TFRs of different kinds, your different airspace, like the Class B airspace here. So having a good working knowledge of all that, for both, your in-flight, but for planning your route and knowing where you're going to have those restrictions to your flight or things to deal with on your flight. So glide rings, this is a very glider specific thing. It could be thought of as helping you determine go ahead points, but also I would think kind of bailout points if things aren't working the way you wanted. And they basically are just plotting for your glider the altitude versus distance. So at a different altitudes, how far you're going to be able to glide. And so, this one here this is Chrisman Field. So this is all around airports. You could theoretically have it to any point you wanted if you knew it was an area that was a good land out. And at 8,000 feet, if you're over anywhere in this terrain area, by the glide ring, you would be able to make it there, and so forth and so on as you get higher and higher. You want to set it conservatively. I say usually 50% at best lift over drag. It's really going to be up to you, but you don't want to set it to your actual best glide ratio, because that doesn't take into account any kind of winds or sink. So 50% is a good number to use. Another real important thing to understand on these, if you overlay them on your route, is it's not dynamic. That is, it doesn't take into account terrain or other obstructions. So I would think that if you were over on this very outer edge of this glide ring into Chrisman, that there's going to be some terrain here, along the front range, that you're going to have to fly through that. So unless your glider is capable of boring holes in mountains, you can't use this as an absolute. Some different computers have different capabilities of having dynamic effect, and that's useful because it will continually change or morph to show you where you actually can glide to. So if you were over here, it probably would only have your glide going, and you weren't up extremely high. The glide to the east would only go to this mountain range right here. Nonetheless, this is a good planning tool. You need to think about the effects of wind on your planning. It matters when you're considering your track across the ground. You're going to, obviously, as we know, fly faster into headwinds and slower into tailwinds when trying to cover the most ground. So when we're thinking about how far we can glide in a particular direction, we need to know how the wind's going to affect and have an idea what those winds are. And especially important when considering gliding to an outload landing location or final glide to your intended landing location. If you're just flying from thermal to thermal, it's really not a major factor because the thermals are drifting with the wind. But when you want to get to a specific location, the wind is very important to consider. And this is kind of just an illustration of that. So this person that took off here, this is their go-ahead point. And since they're traveling with the wind, they can fly a lot further downwind and have to decide that turn around to go back at an earlier point. So it's not a midway point. And kind of a more graphic illustration. So this case into the wind. So the wind's against the glide. gliding down and thermaling up, and of course they're drifting in that thermal. Well, they've lost, about a mile or nautical mile or so back as they climbed up. So something that always needs to be considered is how much your thermal is drifting with the wind and how much you're going to be going into the wind if that's your direction of flight. Glide computation, the effective sink. So this is one method of figuring out, hey, what is my glide ratio? What is my effective glide ratio right now? If you know what your ground speed is and you know your vertical speed or sink rate in knots, which many varios can be programmed to display in knots, and that's commonly the way we do it. That ground speed divided by that vertical speed, since they're both in knots, it's going to give you your glide ratio. So if you were going 60 knots ground speed and 3 knots of descent, your glide ratio is 20 to 1. Of course, this is going to continually change as your sink rate changes, and it requires that you know what your ground speed is, because that's kind of the key point. If you don't know your ground speed and use your indicated airspeeds, it's going to be a lot less accurate if you have the winds that you're flying into or with. Now this is computing if you know your wind and you know the you're flying at the best lift over drag, or you know at your best what your lift over drag, your glide ratio is for the speed that you're flying. You can take your glide ratio plus or minus the wind, your speed plus or minus the wind over your actual ground speed. So in this case, if we're going 50 knots and we have a 10-knot tailwind, effectively now we're going 60 knots across the ground. Divide that by your best glide speed, that's 1.2. Multiply that times your glide ratio, you get 36. The gist of this is, with a tailwind, you get a better glide ratio. With a headwind, you get a worse glide ratio. And any sink is going to, of course, affect these calculations. This is assuming you have zero sinking error. So a lot of changes are going to be happening as you fly along, based on what speed you're flying, the glide ratio, what the sink is, and what your head or tailwind components are. I've never seen this other than in the book, but there's a manual glide computer. Basically, just if you happen to ever see one of those and want to learn how to use it, it actually will give you, based on your speed, your wind, and your head, your climb or sink rate, what your glide ratio is. So nowadays, a lot of flight computers will calculate that for you to any given point that you want, but it's always important to understand the concepts behind it and know what to do in situations of headwind and sink, and not just rely on your flight computer. I made this little table up myself for me flying in the Discus, and it just gives me a speeds to fly, which minimum sink really never changes. Your minimum sink is always your minimum sink, no matter whether you're lift or sink. But more importantly, the best lift over drag. And so this is kind of like my thermaling side, and this is my final glide side on the right, again for lift, sink, and this also includes headwinds and tailwinds. And it was a really interesting exercise for me to look at the information, because it kind of showed me, relative importance of headwinds versus sink quantities, and what's really affecting me in the glider more. And yes, that is the conclusion of my planning for cross-country soaring.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Casey, do you have another spot, or am I going to take over from here?
Yeah, I just have a few slides.
Okay, go ahead.
Share again. All right, can you see that okay, Armand?
I just see a white screen. Now something's, there we go. Got it. Human factors.
Yeah, cool. So in preparing for your exam, you're going to hear a lot about human factors, and human factors is a huge subject, and there's no way we can even really spend enough time talking about that. But there are some great resources for this. Honestly, the glider flying handbook is probably pretty outdated, and I don't think a lot of examiners really reference that section very much. Definitely read through it, but also read through the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 2, and that's really a much more updated and current aeronautical decision making and human factors section, and probably a great place to start as you're preparing for your check ride. Also understand in human factors that there are internal and external factors. So there's things that we bring to the table when we fly, things like our attitude, our preparation, our knowledge, our skills. And then there's external factors. And external factors are just the things that happen during a flight, headwinds and tailwinds and sink and lift and all those things. And that's important to understand that it's really a mesh of those that we call human factors. One of the things that you almost certainly be asked on your check ride is what are one of the 5 hazardous attitudes that you exhibit? And those are anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. So be familiar with these. Understand that we all at times do illustrate one of these hazardous attitudes. And understand what they mean and what the antidote to that is. I think the antidotes are pretty simple. Follow the rules; they're usually right. Well, the way we get all these rules is unfortunately lots of accidents and lots of learning through the years. So there's a reason we have rules of the ridge, right? Lots of midair collisions. So understanding the rules and following them are important. Don't be impulsive. Think first. One of the greatest captains that I learned to fly with early in my airline career always had the maxim of in an emergency, wind your watch, right? There's very few things that are going to happen in an aircraft that you have to think in split-second reaction. Typically, the further from the ground we are, the more time we have, and hopefully we have a few seconds to think. So maybe take a moment to understand what's really happening before overreacting to something. Understand that everything can happen to you. You shouldn't be invulnerable. Understanding the stories of the people who have come before you, and the lessons learned. I really enjoy and have enjoyed learning to fly sailplanes because it's something new to me. And I spend hours after a flight talking to the other pilots as they come back and understand what they saw and how they handled things and their decision-making process too. And if something bad happened, how did they deal with it? How did they deal with it in the past? That's very important. Taking chances is foolish. That's a great statement. That kind of goes to impulsivity. If you're sitting up there and you wonder, hey, I wonder if I can loop this thing today. If you haven't prepared for that and understood that the aircraft is prepared for that and have some training on that and spin training and all the things that could go wrong, we don't want to find ourselves in that position of just taking random chances because we haven't really thought it through. And then resignation, you're not helpless and you can make a difference. And I think this is a great one that I see a lot of times when I conduct check rides at the airline is never stop trying, never just resign and say you don't know something, you can't figure something out. If there's something that you're asked about on your exam or something in real life you don't understand, find it, read it, ask for help. And really try to understand that subject, go look in your book and find it if you need to. So understanding that it's not something you can ever just walk away from. We can never really just stop. We can't stop the airplane. So once you're airborne, it's up to you to figure out the right resource to solve the problem. One of the things that you probably aren't going to find in the FAA publications, but this is a very widely accepted understanding of threats, is this called the Swiss cheese model. And this is created by Dr. James Reason in the early 90s, who was a human factors psychologist, worked with NASA. And he really came up and coined this concept of threat and error management. And understanding that as we're flying, there are going to be things externally that happen. There's going to be hazards that we have to face. However, there are countermeasures that are already in place for that. Things like proper maintenance on your sailplane, pre-flight weather briefings, having conducted that, doing a thorough aircraft pre-flight, including a positive control check, and then understanding the aircraft limitations. These are all countermeasures to the hazards, and hopefully a hazard doesn't make it all the way through. We hopefully will capture that and mitigate that threat or that hazard by a pre-existing system. However, where accidents happen, or we can call them losses in this case, is when a hazard makes its way through each of these countermeasures and is never properly captured. So that's really the basis of threat area management. And I've really simplified this, so please understand this is an oversimplifications, but understand that threats are typically external. We can have personal threats, but in this case, things are going to happen in our environment to us. And if not properly captured by one of these countermeasures, those threats can become errors. And if the errors are not recognized, you might make a mistake, but the mistake might not be fatal. But if we don't properly handle those errors, that can become an undesired aircraft state, which can lead to an accident. So very high level threat and error management model. But I hope that makes a little more sense in how we prepare ourselves as professionals and as upcoming pilots to bring everything to the table to limit the risk that we face during every flight. This is from the pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and I think really kind of states the same thing. And this is really about managing risk. Obviously, it starts with identifying the hazard. We need to recognize what's happening, and that really happens by using all of our senses, by listening and hearing the sound of our glider, by feeling the flight controls. If things are getting stiff, we identify that, hey, maybe my flight controls are freezing up in the hazard. That could be a problem. I had an interesting hazard that popped up when we were down in Salida at the sailplane camp. I took I heard this strange popping 2 days in the cockpit, and I couldn't understand what it was. And it was a weird, like, groaning and then popping and sudden popping, which I'd never heard before. And I figured out on the second day, it was my Lunchable that was exploding as I climbed up over 16,000 feet every day. And I finally figured it out when I smelled lunch meat on the second day. But it was something that was new. And that night I checked the glider and checked for any broken items. Just really couldn't understand what that hazard was. But then assess those risks. We want to have controls for that risk. We want to make a controlled decision. And then we want to apply that. We want to use those controls and then monitor the results. Make sure that what we've assessed and what we've put in place is actually producing the results that we expect in this case. And then that process starts over and over and over again. So be prepared to talk about how you handle risk in the aeronautical decision-making phase of flight. So that's really high level. And I think Jeff might talk about physiological factors at some point here too, but really high level threat and error management and risk assessment process. Thanks, Armand.
Thank you, Casey. Jeff, you have anything else?
Yeah, I mean, like Casey said, I did a presentation on the physiological aspects. I can run through it pretty quick because I know you have something to talk. Okay.
Yeah, please proceed.
Right. Okay, you're probably not seeing it, are you? Are you seeing human factors?
No, sir.
All right. Yeah, I don't. I thought I had gotten the hang of this short sharing thing, but I'm not seeing it up on my.
You got the green button? Ah, there you go.
All right, good. Okay, so great. I'm going to talk, it's more just, this is kind of more down to earth. This is basically talking about things that happen with our body and to a certain extent our thought processes due to different factors in flight. So I'll go through these and not in a particular order, but hopefully we can kind of see how they all come together at the end. So first thing is fatigue. So fatigue is an undesirable thing that happens to us all the time on the ground and in flight. Obviously, it's a more critical environment than a lot of times that we're in on the ground. So, can cause increases in mistakes, poor judgment, and poor decisions, or worst of all, no decision at all. The primary cause of fatigue is a lack of sleep, and getting good sleep or rest is the only way to prevent that. Scientists divide fatigue into acute and chronic. There's a list here of things that can happen that cause acute fatigue. If you have hypoxia, physical stress, psychological stress, and sustained psychological stress that will cause your acute fatigue. Chronic fatigue is we're talking about over long periods of time, and it's more of usually of a psychological type of factor to it. Stress is something that we deal with all the time, every day, and we certainly have a lot of stresses in soaring flight. And it's simply the body's response to physiological demands placed on it. So probably heard before, there's good stress and bad stress. So basically, stress is just a way that our body deals with something that it perceives as a danger or a threat or something that needs to be acted on. So that's your fight or flight type of response that you would get. Chronic stress is more of a, just an ongoing burden of things, and it exceeds your ability to cope, and causes your performance to fall sharply. Again, chronic is the one that is something that needs professional attention on. All right, moving into hypoxia, which is a topic that we've discussed many times, including tonight. And it's basically just not enough oxygen in the body. And the symptoms vary with individual, but include this list here of things. Things that I personally have as a hypoxia is that I notice a visual impairment. I get more of a kind of a tunneling of my vision, and the lightheaded or dizzy sensation. The only way to really know is to have hypoxia, and the best way to, the only way you really should do that is to go to a hyperbaric chamber and get to actually experience what your symptoms are under a controlled environment. There's 4 causes or 4 forms of hypoxia. The one that we're going to be most familiar with is hypoxic hypoxia, which is basically just insufficient oxygen available. Hypemic hypoxia is some kind of a deficiency in the blood, which an example of that would be carbon monoxide. If you're not going to have that in a glider, unless you're, I guess, a smoker and you're smoking in your glider. Stagnant hypoxia, which is just the G-forces effect. So if you're doing aerobatics in a glider and you feel that graying out, that's stagnant hypoxia. And histotoxic is more of a chemical type of a thing. So it's almost like a poisoning reason that your tissues can't absorb oxygen. We've been through this already on the pilot in command. If you do take a passenger up, just remember that FAA requires that you have oxygen available to them above 15,000 feet. I think that we have the electronic pulse demand system in all of our club gliders, and I think it's probably pretty ubiquitous through the glider community. And it's a pulsating type of flow that helps you conserve oxygen, and it increases that amount of flow as your altitude goes up. And there's the different modes, and Armin touched on this, that is a personal preference. A lot of pilots will set it for 5,000 feet so that it's working even on the ground in Boulder, or as 10,000 feet. Hyperventilation is the excessive rate and depth of respiration leading to abnormal loss of carbon dioxide in the blood. So it's a insufficient amount of carbon dioxide. It's basically a chemical imbalance that you're putting on your body. The reason you might have this happen is under stress. You might hyperventilate, breathe too quickly. The symptoms of it are quite similar often to hypoxia. And so, first thing you want to do is make sure your oxygen is connected. So if you have one of these symptoms, yeah, it might be due to hyperventilation, but make sure that you're receiving the proper oxygen. And basically the cure for it is just to try to breathe at a more normal rate. One of the tricks for that to actually increase your carbon dioxide more quickly is to breathe into a paper bag. Ear and sinus problems. Middle ear block is the inability to equalize pressure outside of your eardrum. So as you're climbing up in altitude, the pressure is able to equalize more easily than when you're descending. And when you're descending, that pressure builds during descent and causes a pain. Sinus block is a similar occurrence, but it's just occurring in the sinuses. So it's an unequal pressure distribution that is not just relieving itself. The big thing on this is don't fly with a head cold or a sinus infection or a real bad allergy. So if there's something that's making it where your ears are kind of plugged up or your sinuses are already aching, don't fly. And in the glider community, we're unpressurized, so the problem is exacerbated. Don't take medications for these problems, prescription or over the counter. I say without aeromedical examiner advice. I realized that we were not required to have a physical for class 1, 2, or 3 physical to fly gliders, but we're still responsible for making sure that we're flying healthy and that we don't take medications without knowing what they're going to do. The cure, if you will, to ear blockages is to do the Valsalva maneuver, which you may have seen, where you plug your nose and blow against that, and it pressurizes your ears. Okay, spatial disorientation is the lack of orientation with regard to position, attitude, or movement of the glider in space. And we have 3 different systems that kind of go into our orientation system. The vestibular system are organs that are found in the inner ear that sense position by the way we are balanced. The somatosensory is basically just our feel. So when I was talking earlier about seat of the pants, that's a somatosensory type of feeling, and it's basically throughout your body, just the feeling of gravity and its effects on your different parts of your body. And your visual system, of course, which is what we're most used to using to figure out how we're oriented in space, what we see. So all 3 of these things work together, and if they're not working together, that's what causes discomfort. That that's when someone gets airsick, it's because of a incompatibility with what they're feeling in these systems with what their eyes are seeing. Spatial disorientation can happen to anybody, just depending upon your external environment, your health. So we want to fly healthy, stay out of clouds, because we don't have instrumentation to fly in clouds, and we will get disoriented. And also don't want to fly in low visibilities. I won't talk in detail about visual illusions. They don't really fall into spatial disorientation per se, but I think one that is important for us to understand is the runway width and runway slope illusions, because if you were to have to land out, of course you can't control what, say, the size of the field that you're going to land in, and a narrow runway, or in the case of landing out, field, is going to make you look higher than you actually are. So, you're trying to figure out your glide path in, just realize that if you're landing in a relatively narrow compared to length field, it's going to make you look higher than actual. And the same thing, the opposite. If it's a wide field, it's going to make you look lower than you really are. And upsloping. So if we have to land out, and we have to land on a sloping surface, of course, we want to land upslope, and that's going to make you look steeper than you actually are coming into land. So these are illusions that we may have to deal with at times flying a glider. And I just wanted to also briefly talk about visual scanning, because we were talking about looking out for other gliders. And you need to realize that your eyes have your eye has a central blind spot. So if you're just staring at one point, you can, and it's this very small point, you may miss that. So to help avoid miss any aircraft, you want to try to systematically scan the sky in segments, instead of just looking haphazardly across the sky, is to actually look at the sky in segments. Of course, this is most germane if you were flying straight and level, where you're able to actually scan different segments of the sky, and then kind of in a pattern across, and then down and across, and down and across. And I think this chart's interesting one. I've seen others that are even more dramatic, just showing that at a mile away, how an aircraft that's just a typical light aircraft will look. It's pretty small. You can imagine if it was 5 miles away, how small it would be. But at a mile away, you only have 14 seconds till impact. And the way to know that you're on a collision course, if you have spotted an aircraft, is it's not going to be moving on your canopy. So if it's moving across your canopy at any rate, you're not on a collision course with it. But if it's just kind of fixed in place in your canopy, you're going to be on a collision course with it. But you have very little time, even at a mile away. And then again, this is light aircraft speed, but gliders are pretty comparable to a lot of light aircraft. And that's not including reaction time, deciding what you're going to do. And as you get closer, it just becomes dramatically smaller. So it really is important for us to clear our flight path, and use good visual scanning, and understand that we don't have much time to see an aircraft if it's getting close. Heat and cold. Heat stroke is inability of body to control its temperature. I think of this more of as a problem if we had to land out. I mean, it will cause dehydration, can cause heat stroke, but if you have to land out in the summer months and you're out in the boonies, you have a high probability of heat stroke happening. So bring plenty of water and make sure you're seeking out shade. In case you talked about, high altitudes, wave flight in winter, and problems that can cause. One thing to think about is that it can cause your canopy to frost over. I even got some of that today on my flight. So know how to handle that opening event and having something to wipe the canopy. I think this is kind of interesting that you're actually more likely to, your kidneys produce urine quicker. So we think of, well, if it's cold, I don't need a lot of water, but your body's processing water out quicker. So you actually can get dehydrated even if you're cold. And be prepared for extreme cold if you're flying over the mountains in the winter months. Again, it's the same concept that if you did have to land out, unfortunately, that you would not be in a bad way immediately. Dehydration, first noticeable effect is fatigue. Very insidious, even though the cockpit is in a very active place. The tendency, and we talk about this in gliders, is not to drink enough because you don't want to have to pee. It's uncomfortable or difficult to pee in the glider, but it's important because, as this chart kind of talks about, being dehydrated can lead to a lot of the problems that we've been talking about. Alcohol, you want to know what the rules are, the FAA rules on that. So 8 hours minimum between a drink and flying. Also understand that it's no flying under the influence of alcohol. So if for some reason you're still not right after 12 hours of drinking, you're still subject to the FAA rules. No flying over 0.04% alcohol at or over. And you're not allowed to carry a passenger. So if you're taking someone up in the backseat of a sailplane, they can't be buzzed. They can't be, high. That's against FARs. And this kind of talks more about the requirements. And even though we don't require a physical, we're still subject to 61.53, which basically says that if you're not fit to fly and you know that you're not, or you're taking drugs that you're not allowed to, that could influence your ability to fly the airplane, that you're in violation. And here's a chart, which obviously I won't go through, but is in the book on all the different effects of different types of drugs, both over the counter and prescription. Finally, decompression sickness. If you're someone that likes to dive and also likes to fly gliders, know what the recommendations are on decompression, how much time you want to have between diving and flying. Again, we're unpressurized aircraft, so it really does apply to gliding. And last, kind of a wrap up of, is the I'm Safe checklist. Kind of goes into a lot of those things that I was just talking about, and it's a nice acronym to think about every time before you go fly. All righty.
Jeff, thanks. That was a great presentation on the human factors. Any chance you can put that slide up again on the I'm safe? I'd really like to emphasize that, because that will be on everybody's oral when they do their check ride. You can count on this. So let's kind of go over it. Only takes a moment. The I'm safe. Okay, there we go. I'm safe. Illness. So if you're not feeling well, for gosh sakes, don't strap on a glider and go flying, because you'll get a lot worse. And medication. If the bottle says on it, don't take this while operating heavy equipment, don't say, well, a glider's not heavy equipment. Well, yeah, it's probably even more dangerous than operating heavy equipment. So, watch out for your medications. Stress. Jeff talked a little bit about the two types of stress. We have a short-term stress and a long-term stress. Alcohol, self-explanatory. If you don't believe that alcohol deadens or lengthens your reaction time and all that, I highly recommend you give it a try on Condor, which is the flight, the Soaring flight simulator. Go fly a short task, make a landing or something, and then drink a beer or whatever you like drink, and then try it again. And I think you'll see that, gee, that's a really bad idea to go flying that way. Fatigue. Fatigue before you take off is pretty bad. But I've also noticed you can get fatigue while you're flying a glider and along cross country. And if you really start getting tired, you need to go back. And then E, you've got enough. I've also heard eating, drinking, but don't fly when you're hungry, for gosh sakes. And then water, you got to have a lot of water. So anyway, glad you put those on. Thanks, Jeff. If you'll go ahead and take that off, I'll get started on the next topic, which is oh, here it is over here. So Yeah, you gotta move this around, don't you? So anyway, we're gonna present here on FAI badges, rules, and requirements. There are badges that you can get as a glider pilot, and it's not just, these badges aren't just so you can tell your friends you got this badge, but it really helps you do the things that you need to do to become a better pilot. And there's a large number of rules for getting an FAA and requirements for getting an FAA badge. And you got to follow them pretty carefully. It's really easy to miss a rule or requirement and then you don't get the badge. Even though you essentially flew the flight, they're pretty strict about it. And where it's all laid out is in the FAI's sporting code. And you can get a copy of the sporting code off the SSA, Soaring Society of America website. And then you have to declare the task before you go and try to get that badge, or do at least some of the parts that you need to do to get a badge. You have to have an approved IGC flight recorder. So maybe you have an UDI. The UDI is a pretty good device, but guess what? It's not approved as an IGC flight recorder. You can use the UDI, what comes off the UDI to be for certain things, like OLC, the online contest. That online contest will take them, but you need you need a special IGC flight recorder that will do it for you. So the smartphones and the ODIs won't qualify, but FLARM will qualify, and a lot of the flight computers will qualify. So make sure you've got a qualified flight recorder. And you must have an official observer who can verify that you made the flight. That observer really only needs to see you take off, or know for certain that you took off from that airport and all that. That can be any SSA member who holds a B badge or higher. So somebody who's at least gotten one badge can be your official observer. It's not that hard. I've been official observer on a number of flights. The first, there's an A, B, C, and bronze badge that can be worked on. And those are actually come from the FSA, the Soaring Society of America, not the FAI. And I don't use them because it's a little extra work. It really just covers what you're going to do to get your license anyway. So I tend not to use them, and none of the other instructors at Boulder, Soaring Society of Boulder, tend to use the ABC and bronze badge. We like to jump after someone gets their license and rating. We like to have them go get the silver badge. And the silver badge, it requires a flight to or past a turn point or airport that's 50 kilometers from the release point. And there's other requirements that are in the sporting code, like your release point, how far it has to be from the airport that you go back to. You could fly past that turn point and then land out beyond it. You don't want to do that so much around here. But all you need to do is from your release point, fly 50 kilometers to a known location and cross that location, and then you can go do whatever you want for the rest of the flight. You also have to have an in-flight gain of at least 1,000 meters, or about 3,300 feet. For any of the ones that we do around here, where you have to fly out over the mountains, you're going to have to gain that much altitude anyway, or you're not going to make it to the turn point. You have to have a flight that lasts at least 5 hours. Doesn't have to be the same flight, doesn't have to be declared. So you can just have some random flight somewhere that was more than 5 hours, and then have your silver badge flight to a 50 kilometers away airport. on different flights. The Soaring Society of America has suggested, oops, that should be Soaring Society of Boulder, sorry, has a suggested task starting at Lee Hill and overflying to Lookout Mountain. And to safely complete this task, you have to get more than the 1,000-meter climb. And the 5-hour flight can be done on another test. And I will show, as I go through this, I will jump over and show these actual tasks in CU software, SEEYOU software. The next badge that one would work on after getting the silver badge would be the gold badge. And the gold badge, of course, is a little harder to get than the silver badge. You have to fly a 300-kilometer declared triangular task. That task, when you declare it, gets to be kind of harder because you got to go to different turn points and you got to have lift near those turn points. So you have to be a little bit better at forecasting weather. And you have to be pretty determined to hit those tasks. You'll find that out. You also have to have an altitude gain of at least 3,000 meters. Doesn't have to be on the same flight as the 300K task. The 3,000 meters is a little short of 10,000 feet, call it 9,900 feet. And then you also have to have the 5-hour task, unless you already got that on your silver badge. Flying a task, it's harder than you think, and good weather forecasting isn't always available, and the lift may not be at the turn points. If you get your gold badge, then you can work on diamond. And the diamond is, again, a little harder. As you read the sporting code, you'll find out that the tolerances on where your start line has to be and all that is more defined and more rigorous. You have to also be able to do a 500K declared distance task, and you have to do a 5,000 meter or 16,405 foot altitude gain. That last part, getting the 16,400 feet, that's not doable in Boulder unless you can get a wave window to get you up above 18,000 feet, because we're starting at 5,000 feet. So obviously you can't squeeze that 16 in there. There's not a lot of places where it's easy to get that without wave. That's probably pretty rare, in fact. One of the things that the club did last year is we bought, wasn't real expensive, but we bought the Proving Grounds task. And Proving Grounds is being done by this soaring group out of Western Canada. And they are able to monitor these tasks. And these tasks are much easier tasks than the SSA and FAI badge tasks. These are something that just are designed to help the new pilot, the pilot that just got their rating and is going off and trying cross country. And so we have some predefined turn points or small areas that the glider pilot has to navigate through. And then you do that, and then you send in your IGC file, and they're not going to be as, Proving Grounds isn't going to be as fussy as the FAI. You can use the task as it comes off your UDI 2, that sort of thing. So they're much more liberal in terms of what they'll accept. You don't have to declare the task on the ground. You can just go fly it when you're in the air if the lift is there. And so it's an easier way to get started, and we really encourage everybody to go do these tasks. And there's 3 tasks progressing in distance. The first task has been named the Boulder Dash, and keeping the sense of humor up there a little bit, I guess. That task just kind of stays pretty close to the airport, the Boulder Municipal airport so that if you're trying it and you get a little low, you can get back to the airport. The Hill Rambler is a little bit harder. It goes over the foothills, and you do get a little further from the airport. And then there's Niwot Challenge, where you'll get to see the Continental Divide up close. And I'll go over those in a moment. You send your IGC trace to the proving grounds, and that scores it. So I'm going to show some tasks that are illustrated on CU. If I can figure out now how to share the screen. And all right. So the first one, we'll look at the easier ones first, and the boulder dash, I guess. So this is the CU software is very useful for planning your flights and also looking at your traces afterwards, so you can see how you actually flew and analyze your flights and learn a little bit. But this boulder dash, there's well, let's see here if I'm showing this well or not. Let me try to get this spotlight here. So here's the Boulder Airport, and the Boulder Dash is set up to be really easy. You can start it at any of the turn points. You still have to fly all the turn points, but mostly you'd probably start it at Lee Hill, because you'd get towed from Boulder out to this canyon here, the Niwot, the left-hand canyon. And you start in this circle somewhere, you fly through it, and then you have to fly out towards Bear Peak. Now this turn is right over Bear Peak, but if you're low, even if you flew it out here, it would still qualify, and your computer should click. And then you go out to Dave's, and then up to Haystack. And as you can see, anywhere along here, if you start getting low and nervous, you can fly back to the airport. So that's the Boulder Dash. The next one, a little bit harder of the proving grounds tasks, is the Hill Rambler. And here maybe you'd start out again at Lee Hill, fly down to Gross Reservoir, and then fly out to Gold Lake, and then fly up to Button something reservoir, and then back to Lee Hill. And next one you'd go for, if you do that, if you get those done, is the Niwot's Challenge. And you'll see this one is even a little bit bigger triangle. So again, you start at Lee Hill, and then you go out to Niwot Ridge. Getting out Niwot Ridge is interesting. It really jumps up, and if you're low, you kind of say, wow, look how high that is. But if you get high, it's pretty easy, and there's usually a lot of lift over Niwot Ridge. Fly up to Drake. That's turn point, little tiny town, that goes from up here, and then you fly back to Lee Hill. So those can all be done with pretty simple. You don't have to declare first and all that, so keep it pretty simple. So once you do those, you're probably going to start wanting to work on your silver badge. And the next one we have is called Lookout for Silver. And the reason it's called Lookout for Silver is, again, you start at Lee Hill and you fly up to Lookout Mountain. That's your 50-kilometer distance. So from here to here is a little over 50 kilometers. The rest of the tasks that it shows is just so you can go fly around. I mean, if you make it up to here, you're probably going to want to go. You could just fly back to the airport. That would be fine. But if you want to stay up, it shows a little bit more of a gold. When you get your silver done, go for gold. There's a lot of ways you could do the gold, and this one shows where you stay really close. It's called Golden Glide because if you're flying this, you can you don't have to get really high to stay within glide of the airport. You can probably stay within glide of the airport at 12, 13,000 feet with this. And so here's the airport right there. And so as you can see, the distance even to Lookout Mountain, we know is only about 50 kilometers. And then down here, Evergreen looks like about a similar distance. So that would get you to gold. And if you do the other things, and then, you know, there's diamond gold where you can, I did very recently, well, a couple of weeks ago, I did a flight similar to this one to get my diamond gold thing. I turned it in. It'll be in Soaring magazine in a month or two. So it was something similar to this. It wasn't exactly this one that I did. And then there's the front range diamond distance, the 500, it's 500K, showing 271 nautical miles, but that's about 500, a little over 500 kilometers. And this one shows a lot of back and forth. You can do that and you can still stay within, you'll have to be higher, but if you're at 17,000 feet, 17,000 feet, you'll always be within glide of Boulder, which is right there, Boulder Airport, which is right there where I have the little notch. So at any rate, those are the long and the short of getting badges. And we want to encourage everybody to go get silver or gold badges. It's a really good thing to do, not just because of the glory of it all, but you'll learn a lot. You'll be a better pilot if you go and get those badges. You'll just have to learn things. Some of it will be frustrating. Do expect that you won't get all the rules and regulations right the first time or even the second time. Maybe you will, but don't count on it. There's a lot in the sporting code and you need to read it, understand it, and it's easy to miss something. So there's a lot of frustration there. So at any rate, this kind of concludes this series of ground schools where we go over the topics in the glider flying handbook. And as you can see, we varied things up a little bit. We don't teach exactly but I think we teach the things that you need to know to be a good glider pilot and also pass your check ride. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our students here who have been on and see what kind of discussion or questions or your thoughts on all this. So Nathan, Richard, Johan, Michaela, am I missing anybody here who's a student? Well, Jason Eli has joined, but he's not a student. But welcome to give questions anyway, Jason. So please, anybody have anything?
My comment would be that this has really been a good series. I've really appreciated being able to participate in it. Studying the glider flying handbook and along with this has clarified questions that I had as I've been studying the glider flying handbook, trying to prepare for it, and also helpful, very helpful in preparing for the written, the aeronautical knowledge written test, not the check ride, not thinking about the check ride, but for the aeronautical knowledge written test, FAA's test. So I really appreciate it and the efforts everybody has made, making it possible for us.
Yeah, do keep in mind this, what we're teaching here really isn't, there's a little bit of what you might see on the FAA knowledge, sometimes called the written test, but really that most of that's kind of different than here. Most of what you're going to find on the FAA knowledge exam is things that every pilot has to know, whether you're flying a balloon or you're flying an airplane or a helicopter or whatever. It's things about the license. It's things that, about your license, what, you have to do to get it and keep it. Runway markings, a lot of the FARs and what they mean, and what a license gives you and doesn't give you, what privileges and limitations go with the license. So this series here has been more about, flying the glider and what you need to know to fly the glider. I don't think it'll really give you a lot of help. It'll give you some, but it won't get you what you need to pass the FAA exams.
Right.
So I really recommend that you get, when you take the FAA written exam, get the ASA prep materials.
Yeah.
Because it's a different body of knowledge generally than what we're going over here. Anything
I'd
else?
just like
David.
to thank you. This is the first one of these that I've been able to attend live. I've watched most of the other ones on YouTube, and I think the thing that I appreciated most, besides the knowledge, is just getting a sense of the culture of the SSB club and the people involved. And I'm excited to turn theory into practice and start earning points for the club next year.
Yeah, well, yeah. You're talking about OLC, the OLC points. Yeah. Yeah, that's something that we put a lot of emphasis on. We want everybody out there flying and getting, putting up their points, doing big flights and putting up the points. 2 years ago, we were #1 in the country. Last year, I think we were #2 in the country. And then we usually a lot of times we wind up in the top 10 in the world. Boulder is an excellent place to fly gliders. It's one of the best places on the planet. And we got some great pilots. I mean, look at the other videos on the other presentations on the YouTube channel, and you'll see a lot on cross country from our very accomplished pilots. And I think it's a great, collection of talks and presentations. But then again, I can't be objective since I was kind of involved with it all. But we've got some fantastic pilots, and I set that up, really where I was trying to showcase the pilot and what you did, but it also, they have some great information here. We got some, you think Sporty helps with that. Glider test prep. Okay, somebody asked about the Sporty's test prep, for glider test prep. There's a few test prep courses that are, study guides, I guess I should say, that are available. And I know Gleam or Glam, however you say it, they have excellent materials for airplane, but really they just don't do it for glider. I mean, they're just not set up for glider. ASA seems to be, and I don't work for them. I don't get any promotion, but I've just found in the times I've had to take exams, and I've had to take them for, instructor, ground instructor, that kind of thing. And the ASA company, they've got glider stuff that will get you through the FAA exam. And here's the answer: Sporty and Glimes. I haven't looked at the Sporty's material, the Sporty's, Jeff, I guess you talked about this, Jeff. Did you use Sporties as
No,
a?
no, actually, I may be speaking out of hand there because I haven't checked it. I was thinking more in terms of just they do test prep, but you're right. Glider is probably a little more
Specialized.
refined.
Yeah.
Yeah, specialized.
Yeah. So anyway, I can't really speak to Sporties. I know when I studied for my instructor rating, I used Glam or Glime, however you say it, and it was really good for the fundamentals of instruction portion, but the glider stuff, I mean, it just wasn't even it wasn't there, and so I had to go buy another. And I called Glim and I talked to one of their, helping instructors, and he probably knows he was probably pretty good, but he didn't know what a glider looked like, or and he was admitting like, yeah, I just don't know glider. And I'm like, yeah, no, I can see that, but thanks anyway. So
There was another one I used for helicopter again. I don't know if it's good for glider, called Shepherd Air, and they have a very good setup, but I don't know if they have glider, but it was really good.
okay, well, we can check out Shepherd. But yeah, make sure you get one that's for glider, otherwise you won't. So at any rate, all right. Anything else? If not, we'll go ahead and end this series of 5 and give a special thanks here to Jeff and Casey for putting together these very, very well done presentations. You guys did a terrific job. You probably noticed I very rarely chimed in, and that isn't because I wasn't listening. It was because it's like you guys got it down. So I'm excited about seeing both of you get your instructor ratings, and I think also Elliot Crawford, our DPE, will be excited to see you guys do so well on that, because you guys know it really well, and it was great presentations and all that. So thanks so much. Thanks everybody for following along, and this will be on the YouTube channel probably by tomorrow, by noon tomorrow or so. So check out and check the other on there. There's a list. I forgot what they call it in YouTube, but I've got it linked to, I've got the primary ground schools linked together. This will of course be the most important part, this series of 5, but there's also special ground school sessions on airspace. I did one on airspace for gliders, which does not cover all of airspace by any stretch of the imagination. It's strictly for what you need to know as a glider pilot. And then we also have some others, and we'll build some more things. I just bought a camera today and a GoPro, and I'm going to do some other films. I'm going to do some other primary ground school stuff, like being a launch assistant. I have some very, I see a lot of what they call wing runner training, and I'm not happy with what I see. So I'm going to make my own, and going to really show what a launch assistant is not a wing runner, because really you don't have to run. You only need to take steps. But what's more important is how one assists the pilot to get ready so that that pilot launches and, doesn't rush them, and is basically just at the service of the pilot. So I have some very particular, I'm kind of fuzzy about that. And as a matter of fact, the other day, somebody rushed me and I missed something on my checklist, a ground assistant there. He rushed me and I wound up missing putting my cannula on. And at any rate, I was able to get my cannula on and get the EDS turned on after I took off, but it's just really important. So anyway, I diverge here, sorry. But there'll be more, and there'll be there'll be more ground schools like the ones that, the bulk of the ones that are on there that are more the advanced ground schools. There's more of that coming now that we're in the off season. I'm going to try to invite pilots from around really around the world to add to that list, and hopefully we'll have a great YouTube channel with great resources on flying gliders, and it's all going to be dedicated to glider. It's not going to be really much of anything else. So with that, thanks so much, everybody. I see there's a couple chats. Let's see if there's anything else I need to add on this. Okay, I guess there's nothing else. So anyway, everybody, thanks so much for watching this series. And Jeff and Casey, you guys did a great job. So thanks so much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Armin.
Thanks to you, Armin.